Then it has to pass through the fuel filters. It is these filters that have to remove impurities that are there, if any, in the fuel. And by the way, this report has also examined the fuel, and they've come to the conclusion there was no impurity in the fuel. There was no contamination to the fuel. The fuel control unit then regulates the flow of fuel to the engine. The fuel and air mixture is mixed in the carburetor. Before that mixture is then moved on to the cylinder for delivery. The fuel-air mixture is ignited, and that is what produces power to drive the aircraft. Now, something happened whereby that fuel from the tank to the carburetor and from the carburetor to the engine, that supply was cut off. And it was cut off because the fuel control switches, which are right next to the dashboard in front of the, to the side of the pilot and the co-pilot, those switches, which should have been in the run position, were in the cutoff position, apparently, and can only be manually moved in either direction because they have to be lifted. There's a spring that is attached to it. It has to be moved over a metal constrictor or a lock constrictor that is there, and then moved either up or down, depending on what the action is that the pilot or the co-pilot is doing. And then it has to be released, whereby the spring load action then releases itself. Now, it does raise fundamental questions. Remember, because during this 30 seconds, there's also the the cockpit voice recorder, which is shown, and they've attached this to the report. One pilot asking the other, why did you cut off the switches? And the other pilot responding, no, I did not. So who was pilot one, who was flying the aircraft? Who was pilot two, who was monitoring the switches and the other electronic stuff on the dashboard in front of him? There is pilot flying and there is pilot monitoring. It's not necessary that the more experienced pilot is always the one who's pilot flying. Sometimes, most times, it can also be that the pilot with the more experience is the one who's pilot monitoring, and the PF, or the pilot flying, is the junior pilot. There was a technical glitch which led to both the switches failing. Both the switches, which had to be in the run position, had been moved to the cutoff position. Who did it? Why they did it? Did it happen because of manual action? Did it happen because of technical action? We don't know. Minimum 3 to 4 seconds. Experts say minimum 3 to 4 seconds is required to move the switch either from run to cutoff or from cutoff to run. Also, why can't the voices be identified? Why is the CVR not saying who was the pilot who asked the question, why did you cut off the switches, and who was the pilot who responded by saying, no, I did not? So those are the big questions that are being asked. We still have our guests, and I want to go across to Captain Khalid. I've just laid down as best as I can as a layman, Captain Khalid, that this was a sequence of events that happened on board Air India Flight 171. What are your initial thoughts, your assessment of, again, the question that boggles the mind is, why was that fuel control switch in the cutoff position?
Okay, a very long-awaited AIB report that has been, preliminary report that has been shared, and you have covered in most of the detail what needed to be covered. And as the previous guest was saying, these switches do not have a movement of automatic movement mechanism. Like, it is not something that it will move. There is a failure and that will cause it to move. Okay. The language that the AIB has used is actually opening all kinds of speculation that we are discussing. This fuel switch has two positions, cut off and run. And every pilot, every engineer will use this switch with this fuel switch moved from cutoff to run, or moved from cutoff or run to cutoff. There is no word used as transitions. Okay. Transition, if you use transition, you are giving an implication that it is doing automatically. So this language that has been used in the AIB report is now the reason of our discussion. Okay. While what would be the right word to be used would be that the fuel cutoff switch at 8:42 stamp was moved from run to cutoff within 1 second. At 8:56, the switches were moved to run position. That would have been absolutely correct, but they used fuel switch was transitioned.
Why do you think that is?
Right, because that language is true for fuel shutoff valve. This switch controls the fuel shutoff valve, the valve that transitions from cutoff to run and run to cutoff. So that valve, we don't say it moves from this to this. We say it transitions from this to this. So the report has now put in two technical statements and stitched it together for whatever reason that they thought it to be the right one. Okay. And instead of saying that, this switch does not cause engine to fail or on, it is the fuel shut-off valve that decides the position of fuel shut-off valve that decides whether the fuel will go or not. Now,
Okay.
that fuel shut-off valve is also controlled 100% of the time by FedEx and EEC. That these are the two computer systems. Okay, so if the AIB report had to say that fuel shut-off valve transition from run to cut-off, then the pilot action is totally out of the window. Okay, but when you talk about fuel cut-off switch, it transition to this. No, this is a wrong statement. It's a grammatical error. The use of the word transition is a grammatical error. Moved is the right one, and if you use
but tell me, Captain, we've had lots of pilots on the program through the morning, and they're saying that this cannot be electrically or remotely done. This has to be done manually, which suggests that it has to happen inside the cockpit.
Absolutely right. The switch cannot be moved electronically. It has to move physically, and it has to be a very deliberate action. It won't happen because your hand moved up. Because I told you to, if I tell you to move the switch, you will not be able to move it unless you know how to pull it up and then slide it backward. Okay. But what will happen automatically is the transition of the fuel shutoff valve. And if the fuel shutoff valve has transitioned from run to cutoff on its own, then it is a technical problem which is beyond the control of the pilot. And pilot has actually denied any action. You see, it's a statement of a dying person. He says, I did not do it, whichever pilot said. So the one pilot says, I've lost the thrust or cut off the engine, whatever exact wording. And he says, I didn't do it. So it is pretty collaborated from whatever are the two sentences that was decided to be released, that pilot did not do it. Okay. But this switch cannot move. So did they mean fuel shutoff valve being transitioned? AIB has to clear it because there is no word and there is no sense being conveyed. Fuel switch transition from run to cutoff. It conveys nothing. It's a wrong statement. That is one part. Number two is that the pilot would move the switch, cycle it to off and then to start, but that will be in response to dual engine memory action, dual engine failure memory action in which they are trying to relight.
Okay.
Restart the engine, and that could have been done. There was 40 seconds of conversation between pilots, and it would be pretty intense conversation. Okay, why do we know only just two sentences?
I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, there would be at least 30 sentences that would have transpired between them. Someone would have panicked also, someone would have said, right, sir, we would have known exactly what has happened. But just two statements have been given to us. It conveys only one thing, that the pilot did not do it. And it could not be done automatically. Do they mean fuel shutoff valve? Because we know the aircraft performance will get affected by not the position of these switches. They will get affected by the position of the fuel shutoff valve. And fuel shutoff valve definitely was closed. And it can be closed despite this movement. The AIB also brings out an advisory of that FAA of 2018 and 19. I don't know why. Because that advisory is advisory. It is not mandatory. And why it is not mandatory, I'll tell you a very good reason for it. Because last 40 years, aviation has developed. If you put a collar around here and you prevent it from coming down, then in case of dual engine failure, you will now have to do two actions to do the same thing to revive the engine. So they have kept it from the legal point of view, they have kept it as advisory, not mandatory. So that if the pilot needs to, there is a fire and you need to cut off the engine. Then now there is two actions: remove the collar and then move the switches. So that is advisory. Okay, and that it will, if that particular switch has failed, it does not mean that engine will go off. Let me tell you, these aircraft are designed. If all the electrical fails, fuel shutoff valve defaults to open position. Once again, let me tell it to your individual. All aircraft in this world, if all the electricity fails, you remove the battery also, then the fuel shutoff valve defaults to open position, not closed position. So going to closed position is a positive electrical action.
Okay.
Okay. So the AIB only clears one thing, that the flap was in the right position, aircraft was maintained very nicely, aircraft was perfectly flyable till 3 seconds after takeoff.
Okay.
And thereafter, when the fuel shutoff valve closed, another 4-5 seconds, it would lose power and pilot would be confused because they did nothing to do it. And they asked, the other one said no, and thereafter they might have recycled the switches. That is true.
Possible,
the thrust lever is in the back position, which is also right, because in case of a dual engine relight, you don't keep the thrust lever fully forward, you bring it back. Like, when you're trying to start the engine, you don't press the whole accelerator and do the startup of the engine. So you could have done, but all these things are secondary to engines have failed, not primary. The primary reason of engine failure. Moving of switches is secondary to engine failure, not primary cause of the engine failure.
Fair enough. That's a fair point. You have something to add?
Yes, I was just making going through what the photographs that they have put out. The thrust lever that you're talking about that actually shows the position.
It is in the back.
Yes, it is at the back. It is at the back.
Can we show that? Can we show this picture?
Yes.
On
so this is the thrust lever. I mean, exactly.
And this is the right action by the pilot. While the aircraft engine is trying to restart itself, the thrust lever has to be idle. So here the pilot is totally at the top of the thing. It is just technically the technology is not helping them.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
No electrical failure will cause fuel shutoff valve to close. No malfunction will cause fuel cut. I don't know why fuel cutoff switch is the first and the only action in the report or mentioned, because fuel switches do not anywhere in the entire Boeing manual. Boeing themselves have not referred to fuel switch transitioning or the checklist says move this to this, move this to this. The word transition does not apply to fuel switch.
Right. Right. So these are the two pictures that you're referring to. This shows the fuel switch, and this is the thrust lever. And like you're mentioning, the thrust lever is pulled backwards. So the sequence, like you're mentioning, is what the report also has concluded here.
Yeah. So when the pilots are attempting to relight a shutdown engine, I'm not rated on 787, but across the world, the aircraft engines thrust levers have to be brought back for it to give it the best chance to relight.
But so if you give me a moment, while the picture seems to suggest what you're showing, I'm just reading through what the paragraph preceding it says, and if you can weigh in on that. The thrust lever quadrant sustained significant thermal damage. Both thrust levers were found near the aft or the ideal position. However,
that is factual statement.
Yes,
that is a factual statement.
However, the EAFR data revealed that the thrust levers remained forward takeoff thrust until the impact. Both fuel control switches were found in the run position. The reverse levers were bent but were in the stored position. The wiring from the TO/GA switches and auto throttle disconnect switches were visible but heavily damaged.
Okay. I am not privy to EAFR report. Okay, but I can see the visuals of it. It is in exactly right position that the pilot would, if the pilot is at the top of the game, this is how the aircraft will be. The landing gear will be down because there was loss of power. The flaps will be at the same place because you have not accelerated. The engine run switches will be at the engine run position and thrust levers will be idle. This is exactly how it will be when the pilot has done no mistake.
Okay. All right. We'll take a break on that note, but our coverage continues on the preliminary report of the Aircraft Accident Investigation Board, which was constituted to look into what caused AI171, Air India flight from Ahmedabad to London Gatwick, to crash with 242 passengers on board. 241 of them died. There were 20 others who died on the ground as well in the hostel where the impact had happened. And today we have some preliminary findings, some preliminary answers as to what led to the crash of AI Flight 171. Quick break, but our coverage continues on the other side.
This is News 18 Network. India's largest news network.
Welcome to our continuing coverage here of the preliminary finding of the Aircraft Accident Investigation Board, the AAIB, which was constituted under the Ministry of Civil Aviation. It has released a 15-page report which goes into what caused the crash of Air India Flight 171 from Ahmedabad to London Gatwick on the 12th of June. Today is exactly 30 days, a month since that fatal crash in which 241 out of 242 passengers died. Let's bring you up to speed with what the findings of the Aircraft Investigation Board are. Remember, the flight reached about 600 odd feet. Number one, both engines shut midair. This is what we've all been talking about for the last 1 month. It was a dual engine failure. The report attests that both engines had failed. Why did they fail? It also shows that at one point, before the 30th second, at one point, engine 1 gets relit. Fuel had been cut off to both engines. We'll get to that in 1 second, why that fuel was cut off. Engine 2 was also relit, but it failed to stabilize. It was not able to generate enough power. Welcome back to our continuing coverage of the Aircraft Accident Investigation Board's preliminary findings as to what led to the crash of Air India Flight 171 from Ahmedabad to London Gatwick on the 12th of June. It's exactly a month since that unfortunate air disaster happened, and we now have some preliminary answers as to what happened in those final 30-odd seconds that led to the tragic crash of AR171. The fatal 32 seconds, the aircraft lifts off from the runway. It begins its flight. This is at 0 seconds, where the aircraft has enough power, it has enough lift to be airborne. It reaches that critical speed of V2 to get to an airborne position, to lift off. 3 seconds after takeoff, the aircraft reaches maximum speed of 180 knots. This has been identified in the report as at 08:08:42 seconds universal time. That's 3 seconds after takeoff. This is maximum speed of 180 knots. The next second, which is the 4th second after takeoff, the first fuel cutoff switch, which is for engine 1, is moved to cutoff position from the run position. These fuel control switches, they need to be in the run position. They are what control the movement of the fuel from the fuel tanks through the carburetor into the engine. 4 seconds after takeoff is when the first fuel switch is moved from run to cutoff. The very next second, which is the 5th second after takeoff, 1 second later, the fuel cutoff switch for engine 2 is also moved from run to cutoff. This is 5 seconds after takeoff. And then, as a result of fuel flow being cut off to both the engines, 8 seconds after takeoff, both the engines lose power. It's a dual engine failure. The RAT, or the ram aviation turbine, is deployed. You can see that coming off from the undercarriage, from the underbelly of the aircraft. It's like a propeller. You can hear the noise from that footage that was shot on the day of the crash as well. The RAT just gives you basic power, basic electric power, basic hydraulic power, so that the pilot and the co-pilot can maneuver the aircraft and take it to safety. Then, 13 seconds after takeoff, that's when the pilot and the co-pilot, and there's a conversation that's been reported in this report as well, the AAIB's report. One of the pilots asks the second pilot, "Why did you cut off the switches?" To which the second pilot responds, "No, I did not cut off." So 13 seconds after takeoff, the first switch is moved back to run position. 17 seconds after takeoff, the second switch, which controls the flow into the second engine, that is moved back from cutoff to run. And then at 26 seconds, which is less than 30 seconds after takeoff, the Mayday call is issued by one of the pilots. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. 4 seconds after that is impact. 32 seconds after flight AI171 took off from runway number 23 of the Ahmedabad Airport, it crashes right outside the perimeter wall of the Ahmedabad Airport. The 787's fuel control switches, they're basically these manual switches which only have 2 modes. They're either in run mode or in cutoff mode. They're used for starting the engine or shutting down the engine or restarting the engine in flight in case some glitch is noticed. Usually, they are touched only at 2 points, either before takeoff or after landing. It basically stops the supply of fuel into the engines. Thereby, it results in the immediate loss of power, loss of thrust. Now, this is not an easy thing to do because there is a metal stop lock whereby you have to lift this switch, move it over that metal stop lock, and then release the spring. It has to be lifted, moved over the metal lock, and then release the spring. There's also 2 guarded metal brackets on either side of these 2 switches so that there is no accidental movement either from run to cutoff or from cutoff to run. But questions are being raised as to how the fuel control switches were cut mid-off. These are the 2 fuel control switches. You can see there's like a blob on top of this switch. You have to lift that because it has a spring-laden action inside. You have to lift that, and you see this metal constrictor. You have to move it over that metal constrictor, either from up to down, which is from run to cutoff, or from cutoff to run. You have to move it manually over this metal constrictor, and that can only be done through manual action. Then you lift it, move it over the constructor, and then leave the release, which is when the spring goes back into resting position. So that can only be done manually, and you have to do it individually for both switches. You have to lift it, move it over the constrictor, and then release the spring. So what happened on AI171 was that they realized that both these switches were in the cutoff position, 4th second and 5th second after takeoff. Then both the pilot and the co-pilot try to move it back up into the run position. There is a conversation which has been recorded in this report, a conversation between the two pilots, one pilot asking the other, why did you cut off the switches? The other pilot responds by saying, no, I did not. Arima, what further insights do you have from this 15-page report? And I want to add a caveat. This is a preliminary report. We don't know the entire picture as to what happened, but the preliminary indication is that these fuel cutoff switches, which should have been in the run position, were in the cutoff position.
So I want to take the cue from where you said the pilots were having a conversation. So who was in the position of flying and who was the co-pilot? The co-pilot who was flying, which is the PF, seems to be Clive Kundar. The co-pilot was pilot flying is what the report says, and the PIC was the pilot monitoring or PM for the flight. So Sumit Sabharwal was the pilot monitoring and Clive Kundar was the pilot flying. That has been made clear in this particular report. And the second thing is the sequence of event that the report makes clear. The timeline is quite important because, you know, if we were to presume that there was something wrong with the fuel control switch right from the word go, first thing, when this flight took off from Delhi and landed in Ahmedabad, why was this not flagged off? There was a complaint made and there was a complaint recorded. There was some anomaly in the flight, but it had nothing to do with the fuel switch. In fact, it had to do with the computerized, tilt of the plane's nose that was noted. Nothing to do with the, fuel switch. Then comes the timeline. If you look at the timeline given at 8:08, and this is universal time we are talking about, the maximum speed that you need to hit before takeoff, that speed had been hit at 8:08:39. The aircraft ground sensor transitioned to air mode consistent with liftoff, which means at 8:08:39, the liftoff has happened. At 8:08:42, maximum speed has been hit within 1 second. That's what the report says. Immediately around this time, there seems to be a realization that there's something wrong with the fuel switch. Within 1 second, switch one goes to the cutoff mode. At 8:08:56, this is when the realization hits and an attempt is made to put the switch back to the run mode from cutoff. And between these two timing at 8:08:47, EAFR, which is the flight data recorder data, shows that both engines N2 value passed below minimum speed, which means they were losing speed, and RAT had been deployed. So this entire sequence of event tells us that initially there was fuel supply, the engines were working, and that's why the takeoff happened. Something happened after the takeoff, and that led to the switch getting to the cutoff position. What happened? We don't know.
Yeah, so from 8:08:42, where it hit maximum speed of 180 knots, which is what is V2 is required for liftoff, and then 8:08:56 is when they try to move it back. By 47, the RAT is deployed, and the RAT is only deployed if both engines fail. There has to be a dual engine failure. It's an electronically programmed system, both in the Boeing flights as well as in the Airbus flights, that you have this almost propeller that comes out from the undercarriage. It gives you basic electricity. It gives you basic hydraulic power so that the pilot can then navigate the flight, try and land it in some relatively safe area, as opposed to immediately losing power and thrust like Air India 171 did. But what happened between 08:08:42 and 08:08:56 that led to this fuel cutoff switch being moved from from run to cutoff, we don't know. Most pilots have said that can only manually happen. There is this conversation, one line of which has been included in this report, where one pilot is asking the other, why did you move the switch? And the other pilot says, no, I did not. Can this be electrically done? Can this be mechanically done? Was there a fault in one of the parts? Again, there's nothing in this report which seems to suggest that Boeing or GE have been given notices or have been given advisories to look into this. Again, it's a very, very preliminary report. Something like this has not been released in the previous two crashes. It took months. In fact, in the 2010 crash, it took years for the final report to actually come out. They've never released the preliminary report. This is the first time they're doing that, and it does ask that question: how and why was the fuel control switch moved from run to cutoff? And then the pilots realized it. By the time they realized it and moved it back to run, it was too little, too late. We'll take a quick break, but our coverage continues right on the other side.
This is News 18 Network. India's largest news network.
Welcome to our continuing coverage here of the preliminary finding of the Aircraft Accident Investigation Board, the AAIB, which was constituted under the Ministry of Civil Aviation. It has released a 15-page report which goes into what caused the crash of Air India Flight 171 from Ahmedabad to London Gatwick on the 12th of June. Today is exactly 30 days, a month since that fatal crash in which 241 out of 242 passengers died. Let's bring you up to speed with what the findings of the Aircraft Investigation Board are. Remember, the flight reached about 600 odd feet. Number one, both engines shut midair. This is what we've all been talking about for the last 1 month. It was a dual engine failure. The report attests that both engines had failed. Why did they fail? It also shows that at one point, before the 30th second, at one point, engine 1 gets relit. Fuel had been cut off to both engines. We'll get to that in 1 second, why that fuel was cut off. Engine 2 was also relit, but it failed to stabilize. It was not able to generate enough power for giving the aircraft enough lift and thrust to move up. It had reached only 600 feet. Number 4, and this is the most important point, the fuel cutoff switches were activated mid-flight. The pilots realized the fuel cutoff switches, which had to be... Welcome to our continuing coverage of the report, the preliminary report of the Aircraft Accident Investigation Board that has looked into why Air India Flight 171 from Ahmedabad to London Gatwick on the 12th of June crashed. My name is Zaka Jacob. This is what the preliminary finding is from the Aircraft Accident Investigation Board. It has now submitted its report to the Civil Aviation Ministry. The Ministry has put this up on its website, and we now have some preliminary conclusions as to what went wrong in those harrowing 32 seconds between takeoff and crash of Air India Flight 171. The report reveals that the fuel cutoff switches for both the engines, remember this is a double-engine Boeing 787 Dreamliner, it was moved from the run to the cutoff position. Now, the fuel control switches are the ones that control the movement of fuel from the fuel tanks through the chambers into the engine. The engine requires a mixture of fuel and air for it to be powered and for it to give the aircraft enough power, thrust, and lift. What was realized is that the fuel control switches, which should have been in the run position, were in the cutoff position. The cockpit audio, which has also been, some part of it has been included as part of the report of the Aircraft Accident Investigation Board. It does reveal a certain degree of confusion in the cockpit. One of the pilots, they've not identified who, but one of the pilots is heard asking the other, why did you cut off the fuel control switches? To which the other pilot responds, no, I did not. Investigators say that the crew were unsure about the shutdown or the failure of both engines. While the cause of it is still under investigation as to what led to the failure of both engines, they say it could be some kind of a system failure, or it could be a movement of these switches from the run to the cutoff position. For now, government sources have told CNN News 18, this is not the final report, this is the initial report, this is a preliminary sort of finding. Both Air India and Boeing have put out statements saying that they're continuing to fully cooperate with the authorities. So here are the big findings. Remember, it all boils down to what are called these fuel control switches. These are basically switches that control the movement of fuel from the fuel tank through the chamber into the engine so that the engine can get enough power to allow the aircraft to be airborne. There are only two modes for these switches. They are either in the run mode or they're in the cutoff mode. They're used for the engines to start, shut down, or restart. And there are only two instances, two times where these switches are deployed or employed, either at the start of a flight or at the end of a flight. Now, what does it do? In-flight switch, it stops fuel supply from the fuel tank into the engine, what it does is, the result of it is that there's an immediate loss of power, immediate loss of thrust to the aircraft. Remember, it's not easy. This has to be manually done. The switch has to be lifted because it's attached to a spring. You have to lift the switch so that the spring releases there. You have to move it over a metal lock. You have to move it above a metal lock and then move it from the run position to the cutoff position, or vice versa. It has to be manual action. There are also these two guarded brackets on either side of these fuel control switches, and that is to prevent accidental hitting of the elbow of the pilot or the co-pilot and accidentally moving these switches from run to cutoff or cutoff to run. The question that's now being asked is, how did these fuel control switches cut off just a few seconds? 4 seconds after takeoff is when the fuel control switches were cut off. How did that happen? Here's how the fuel control switches and the entire fuel system of the aircraft works. The fuel is, of course, drawn from the fuel tanks. There are 2 tanks usually on the 787, on the left side and on the right side. The fuel is drawn from those tanks. It is pressurized by pumps because the fuel has to flow at a certain speed into the engine for it to be able to generate power. It flows through these fuel lines. It passes through filters. These filters have to remove any impurities that happen in the fuel. And remember, in this report, they've also checked the fuel from the Bowser and come to the conclusion that there was no impurity, there was no contamination of the fuel. The fuel control unit then regulates the speed and the pressure with which the fuel then flows into the engine. The fuel and air are then mixed in the carburetor before it's delivered in the cylinders, before it's delivered into the engine, and then the engine powers up. It gets enough thrust, it gets enough power. We have Yasha, who's joining us from Pune, I believe. Anvit is tracking the Ministry of Civil Aviation here in Delhi. Arunima is here in our studios as well. Yasha, first of all, what are you hearing where you are in terms of the preliminary findings of the Aircraft Accident Investigation Board and the reactions to it? All right, Yasha, if you can hear me, is there any reaction either from the MOS or from any members of the Civil Aviation Ministry or from members of the Accident Investigation Board as to how they've come to this conclusion, this preliminary conclusion, may I add, in this preliminary report, that it was the fuel control switches that were in the cutoff position which cut fuel supply to the engines, and that led to a dual engine failure, and Air India Flight 171 crashed just outside the Ahmedabad Airport.
So when we speak of the MOS or the reaction from Civil Aviation Ministry, as of now they have not really commented. But of course, what we hear from government sources is that they've gone ahead and said that this is just preliminary report. They'll have to wait. In fact, it might take another 1 month or a longer time for a detailed report to be out, on the basis of which there can be further information that can flow light. Because if we go to see, yes, of course, there have been details about the fact that the fuel went from run to cutoff mode. Of course, there are also details from the black box speaking about the conversation that was there between the pilot and the co-pilot, wherein there was clearly a mention about how did the fuel in fact go from run to cutoff, because the other pilot happened to speak about the fact that he is not really put that on cutoff mode. Here the question remains as to how did this in fact really happen, because it's one of the rarest of the rare incidents, and considering that this does not really speak about either technical failure or human error, then what is it that actually led to this is something that remains unclear, which is where only once is where we hear from the investigative agencies and further details about this very incident is where there could be further light as to what really went wrong for this dual engine failure to take place. Because clearly, as of now, of course, there's information there was a dual engine failure, but how did the in fact switch go from run to cutoff is something that remains unclear. When we speak of government sources,
here in our studios, Anvit is tracking the ministry here. The minister is in Vizag, I believe that's his constituency. We have a reporter there, so the moment you hear from the minister, we will bring that to you. But Arunima, you've gone through these 15 pages. The only conclusion that they've made, and I want to underline again, this is a preliminary conclusion by the Aircraft Accident Investigation Board. They have said that 3 seconds after takeoff, they realized that the fuel control switches, which should have been in the run position, were in the cutoff position. Who did it? Why it happened? We don't have answers to that just yet? What do we know so
Yes,
far?
so the timeline is quite interesting. The timeline, like you said, shows that in the initial part, when the aircraft was taxiing, it had enough power to complete the full run of the full runway length was utilized. So it had enough thrust, enough power to do that. Something happened as it took off. How that fuel control switch moved from run to the cutoff position, there's no answer given to that. But I do want to point out to page 6 of this particular report, which says that there was a Federal Aviation Administration, which is a USA body. They had issued a special airworthiness information bulletin in December 2018, in which the issue of the locking system of the fuel control switch was raised. However, this was an advisory, it was not made mandatory, and therefore Air India, when it was asked after this crash happened whether they had carried out the check of the fuel control switch, they said no, because of course it was an advisory and not mandatory. And this report goes on to say, I'm just quoting, as per information from Air India, the suggested inspection were not carried out as the SAIB was advisory and not mandatory. The scrutiny of maintenance record revealed that the throttle control module was replaced in 2019 and 2023. There is no defect reported pertaining to fuel control switch since 2023 on aircrafts of this kind. So that explains why Air India did not carry out the check. But what did not happen in 2023? Did it happen in 2025? We don't know. There's no conclusion reached, but a lot of unanswered questions.
So between 2018, when this non-mandatory advisory was put out, or even after 2023, after this part was replaced, this flight and thousands of other such Dreamliner 787s would have flown thousands of hours.
Yes, absolutely.
So again, I'm coming back to that question. There's only one way in which this fuel control switches would have gone from run to cutoff, and that is manually. And even if it was a defective part, nothing was reported since 2023, at least in this particular aircraft.
Yes, and again, to quote the report, it says the fuel control switch design, including the locking feature, the exact features about which you are talking, including the locking feature, is similar on various Boeing airplane models, including part number 4TL8373D, which is fitted in Boeing 787 and 788 via aircraft VT A and B. As per information from Air India, I just told you there was no inspection carried out of this part. Scrutiny of maintenance record revealed that the throttle control module was replaced in 2019 and 2023. However, the reason for replacement was not linked to fuel control switch. So even if these aircraft saw the throttle module getting replaced twice, in 2019 and 2023, it was not because a complaint has been raised about a fuel control switch. So far, before the June 12th crash happened, fuel control switch had actually not come into so much scrutiny. Yes, there